wholesome thought. Therefore he made atonement for the dead, that they may be loosed from their sins. In other words, Judas Maccabeus had some soldiers who died during a battle, and they noticed that they had these amulets on. So they collected together some money, and they sent it to Jerusalem for sacrifice to be made for these people who have died. And they also prayed for them. And 2 Maccabees, like I just read, says it's a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead that they may be loosed from their sins. Well, that was the text that Johann Eck quoted. And Martin Luther's response was interesting because unlike the other passages where he contested the interpretation, Luther did something different. He says this, and this is a quote, "There is no proof of purgatory in any portion of sacred scripture which can be entered into argument and serve as proof. For the book of Maccabees, not being in the canon, is of weight with the faithful, but avails nothing with the obstinate." Now, notice what he says here. He says there's no proof of purgatory in any portion of sacred scripture with the qualification which can be entered into argument and serve as proof. So that's the first important point that Luther makes. That, in a sense, there's nothing that Eck can bring forward that would serve as proof of an argument. Okay? And then he goes on to make his second important point, that the book of Maccabees is not in the canon. Okay, so he denies the canonical authority of this book. But interesting enough, he does qualify this. He says, it's not in the canon, but it is of weight with the faithful. Now, apparently, authoritative weight with the faithful, but it will not. It will do nothing with the obstinate. In other words, some pious people might give it authority, but if someone's obstinate against the position, it won't prevail. It doesn't have sufficient authority to overthrow their position. Okay, so in July 8th, 1519, Luther denies the canonicity of Maccabees. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the question then is, was Luther changing something, or was he just being consistent with how things were? You know, the status quo, that Maccabees and the Deuterocanon wasn't scripture. That is the question, okay? Was this a change, or is this consistent with all the other stuff? Well, in my revised edition of Why Catholic Bible or Bigger, I decided I'm going to look into this. Okay, now let me kind of back up a little bit. When I first wrote this book, now this whole book is on nothing but the issue of the Deuterocanon. There hadn't been a book written by a Catholic since the 1890s on this subject, and even then it was only half the book was on the subject. There was a lot that hasn't been updated. I mean, there's lots of articles, don't get me wrong. There's chapters devoted to it. There's monographs written about it. But as far as a comprehensive book, it's not there. It wasn't there. So there's a huge gap. And even the material that did talk about the Deuterocanon from a Catholic perspective, none of them really go into what happened to the books in Protestantism. So that was kind of an area where I decided I'm going to try to do some work. Now, when I first started, I ran across a quote from H.H. Holworth, who was a Protestant historian, a very good one too. And he mentioned that Luther, prior to this debate, used the Deuterocanon as apparently like canonical scripture. And he kind of leaves it like that. He gives a little bit of quotes, and then he stops. And I didn't, it was very singular, but he was able to name the documents. And when my first edition came out, I really wasn't able to confirm what Holworth said about Martin Luther using these books as like authoritative scripture before his denial. So in the years that intervened in my second edition, I found the works, and I've done some research in it, and that's why I want to share with you in this broadcast. Because apparently, Martin Luther did a flip-flop, and for some reason, it's kind of escaped people's notices, probably because, like I said, there really hasn't been a book-length investigation into this issue from a Catholic perspective. So let's do that, okay? Let's look a little bit about how Martin Luther viewed the Deuterocanon and how it changed, okay? Now, we all know that the Protestant Reformation began, or at least it's usually pointed to, on October 31st, 1517. That's when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. Now, like I said, most people believe the Protestant Reformation began at that point. Now, these 95 Theses were a list of propositions for debate. And the funny thing is, there never was a debate on the thesis. Okay, so it's funny he lists these theses, but no one really took them up. There never was a debate on it. So Martin Luther decided, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a paper with the resolutions or explanations of the disputation concerning the power of indulgences. In other words, he's going to write a defense of the 95 Theses. In effect, according to Bernard Losey, this work was Luther's first true Reformation writing. Okay, so this is really the first theological treatise Martin Luther wrote after nailing the 95 Theses. And it's known simply as the Resolutions. Okay, the Resolutions. Now, and this is another important point to remember. Usually with medieval disputations, what they do is they start with what's called a protestiato, okay, where you declare upon which authorities you're going to rely for the debate. So the protestiato starts off the very beginning. You stake out your authority. And in this particular document, Luther does exactly that. He begins by saying this, quote, "First I testify that I desire to say or maintain absolutely nothing except, first of all, what is in the Holy Scriptures and can be maintained by them." Okay? So, did you catch that? He's only going to quote from sacred Scriptures and only those things that can be maintained by it. Now, what's interesting is that in this document, in the first paragraph of Thesis 17, now remember, he's defending the 95 Theses. He says, according to which, and he cites 3 texts in support. One is from Psalm 37, the second is from Psalm 116, and the third is Wisdom chapter 4, verse 7. So he uses wisdom as in support, scripture support, for his thesis number 17. Now you might think, okay, that's kind of a lark. Maybe he just wasn't paying attention. Well, guess what? Later on in that same document, in Thesis 35, he quotes Sirach. Now listen how he does it. He says, quote, "I prove my argument in the following manner. Every doctrine of Christ is an exhortation to penance and points to the fact that men should turn from the devil, the sooner the better. As Ecclesiasticus says," now this is not Ecclesiastes, it is Ecclesiasticus, the old name for Sirach, "do not delay in turning to the Lord. And as the Lord himself says," and he quotes Matthew 25, "and as St. Paul says, Hebrews 4:11, and as St. Peter says, 2 Peter 3. So we have 2 instances in this, the resolutions to the 95 Theses, where he starts at the beginning saying, I will do nothing except, first of all, what is in the sacred Scriptures and could be maintained by them. And then he makes 2 authoritative quotes from the Book of Wisdom and from Sirach, 2 deuterocanonical books, or what Protestants would call Apocrypha. So what does this mean? Well, it seems to suggest that Martin Luther apparently thought that the Deuterocanon could be adduced in debate and used as proof. And it, not only that, but it's also part of sacred Scripture. Now, if that were all we had, that could be just, this could have just been kind of weird. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Maybe it was just an error. Well, on the other side of the break, I'm going to show you how this was not a mistake. Stay tuned, everybody. We're talking about the Deuterocanon, or the so-called Apocrypha. What happened to it in Protestantism?
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. You know, there's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men